So there's this term that I've made up that I think is actually an important concept. It's called selective science. This is the sort of the idea that people pick and choose elements of science that fits within their current worldview. Um, and this sort of presupposes that everybody has a sort of worldview and how the world works, and then they think about the scientific understanding that they like, and then they pick and choose the things that fit within that particular worldview. And I see this a lot, actually, in terms of, the political agenda of some groups, and as well as, within certain individuals that don't like some concepts. So what people don't realize is that the vast majority of science is kind of unified. There's basic principles, and they all kind of stand together, and there's a logic to how everything works. That's the whole basis of it, or that's a really big part of it, is having a logic that sort of works together in between it, that there's unifying ideas behind it. So if you pick and choose the things that you like that fit your worldview, and you sort of dismiss the ideas that you don't like, you're sort of negating the basic principle of science. But, underlying that, what people don't realize, why there is sort of consensus, or why consensus emerges, is because that all of this stuff is pretty uniform, or the basic logic behind it sort of holds up. And so if you pick out one thing, then it negates the whole scientific effort. And so it's hard to pick out certain things. Now, there's sort of, science has, like, they're not necessarily facts, right? Like, I don't like that term. I think if you talk to a scientist, they wouldn't say that they like that term. But there's pretty concrete knowledge, or concrete understanding along certain principles. And then from there, once you get that sort of concrete understanding, then it evolves in different directions. And sometimes those things get like kind of a quirky kind of understanding about the world that, yeah, scientists actually debate about that kind of stuff, and they don't necessarily believe in some of those things that happen, right? Like, I'm very skeptical whenever I read scientific papers. Um, but if it fits a piece of the puzzle, if it sort of makes me understand the world a little bit, then I'm going to draw upon it. The sort of understanding uh, that we're arguing all the time about different things is not necessarily true. What ends up happening is that we kind of argue about how things work, um, but then over time, when somebody has a super sharp idea, we arrive upon the consensus that that sharp idea could possibly explain something. And it's a different way to sort of understand how the scientific effort works, if you think about that. So what happens is that the debate about the sharp idea happens, last. Typically, if it's a super sharp idea, nobody really debates it that much. There's a little bit of upfront debate, but then once you read it, you're like, oh crap, that's a good idea. We're going to sort of latch on to that and make sense of it. But there's this whole idea, this whole wide-ranging understanding that science is, that we don't really know anything, that there's not a lot of consensus, but in fact, I mean, if you look at the fruits of the labor of science, um, you know, technology is from that. And if you cannot see, and this is where I think the sort of thing that's inconsistent with selective science, you look around us and you see that what we have done and what we've accomplished as human beings is pretty fantastic in a lot of ways. So, there's lots of negatives that come from it. But once we determine to do something, it's pretty fantastic. I was watching the Great Ocean Cleanup. This kid who I think it was a science fair project basically when he was 16 years old, and he is stuck with this thing and making. There's this whole collection in the center of the ocean of garbage, and his mission with the ocean cleanup is to clean this up, and it's a giant engineering feat, and all of that cannot be possible. First of all, the whole problem of having all of this garbage and plastic floating around the center of the ocean is because of science and technology, right? The understanding of petroleum, the understanding of polymers, all of that stuff is science, right? It wouldn't exist without that basic understanding. And then in response to that, the great cleanup is all because of scientific efforts in terms of figuring out how to do this efficiently and effectively, how nets work, like all sorts of different things, right? And that's all from a scientific effort. And if you start discounting how all of that works, you have this sort of delusional view of the world, right? Because you're living in this world that produces the fruits of science, or science produces the fruits of whatever, right? Like, even if you, so one of the cultures that sort of negates a lot of the fruits of science of recent efforts is the Mennonite culture, right? Where they would go ride around a horse and buggy. Uh, at least, in the area that I lived for a long time, and they ride around a horse and buggy. Some of them do, some of them don't, but there's a group that does, and it must feel very interesting to live, sort of seeing everything that's going around, right? The sort of fruits of science is happening, but then on top of it, you need to sort of acknowledge that even, the horse and buggy is the fruits of science, right? The fruits of how we understand the world, some basic principles. Um, so even if you go back to the wheel, right, like that, not science in the way that, the typical scientific engine that we think of today, big science, but science in the way of building on knowledge of other people. And there's not a single person that can, in this world, that couldn't necessarily think about this. Now, the scientific effort, the way that we sort of understood knowledge, made a huge, massive change. I believe it was around the 1700s, right? And we started thinking about logic and things like that, and it became, much more widespread because of the Gutenberg press, right? So people became a lot more literate. It was easier to understand science and spread it, and there was just this whole intellectual, it was called the Enlightenment period, where a lot of people started learning about things. And this was a really interesting time because all of a sudden the scientific understanding really sharpened, and our understanding of logic really, really sharpened, where we became a lot more, the mechanism of how it actually works became sharpened. And then, things just blew up, right? Like we had the Industrial Revolution, we had all sorts of things, not necessarily as a consequence of scientific understanding, but definitely it was intertwined, right? So you couldn't do one without the other. And you could work real hard, but if you don't understand the world, you're just working digging the hole. Like you can't get too far. It's the combined effort of somebody in industry coming up with something that says, hey, you know what, I can't do this thing, or this is a really tough problem, and then some scientific effort someplace else that sort of discovers this thing, and then somebody from industry exploiting that. And it's not so much in a negative way that I'm saying all this kind of stuff, but it is in a very positive way that they were exploiting it, right? That they came up with this sort of new solution. They come together, and the scientific effort does make a massive difference. And if you pick and choose which one that you're going to pay attention to, the sort of scientific principle that you're going to pay attention to, it's really just an interesting phenomenon. that has a whole host of factors behind it that I just find very curious. So, anyways, that's my thoughts. Take care and have a wonderful day.